Designing and building warships is a tricky business, and it's abundantly clear that most nations out there don't get it perfect all the time. Canadian ships sometimes cost so much that you might wonder if the decimal point's in the right place. Some German warships are so lightly armed that they might struggle with the whole war part of the job description, while with their combination of things like a tendency towards spontaneous combustion and 25-year refits, some Russian warships seem to struggle with the ship part. Oh, and then there's North Korea, which clearly wins this entire competition by building what they claim to be a modern destroyer, and then managing to somehow fail to even get it into the water correctly, tipping the thing over on the slipway and requiring extensive recovery operation. The point is, when it comes to warships, shit happens. And that for big navies in particular, over a long enough period of time, you can afford the odd strike here or there. As the US Navy is discovering though, the problems tend to mount when you start missing shot after shot. Its program for advanced next-generation stealthy destroyers and potentially cruisers, what gave us the Zumwalt class, ultimately produced far fewer ships than planned, at a higher per-unit cost than planned, that weren't ideal for the modern Navy's needs. While the LCS program produced fewer ships than planned at a higher per-unit cost than planned, that had a variety of issues, and which weren't ideal for the modern Navy's needs. Strike 1, Strike 2. The US Navy's Constellation-class frigate program was meant to reverse that trend. The idea this time was to play it safe. Take an existing, internationally successful frigate design, adapt it a bit for United States service, and come up with something the US could crank out affordably and in huge numbers in order to help rebuild the size of the US combat fleet and augment the overstretched destroyers and cruisers. With Constellation, the US Navy shot for the stars, a ship that balanced affordability, accessibility, and capability. They missed. The ship was morphed and altered until it barely resembled the base design. Costs blew out, delays mounted, and so in November, the axe finally fell, with the US announcing that far from spamming out the new Constellation frigates, the Navy would be cancelling all of the ships except for the 2 that were already in construction, leaving yet another US combat ship program that was too expensive, and with the program cut down to a fraction of its original size. And so in today's episode, we're going to talk not just about the Constellation class, but also the US Navy's losing battle with modernisation more broadly, starting with how the fleet found itself at the end of the Cold War, what its various modernisation programs were meant to do, what they failed to do, and then the story of the Constellation class, and having essentially cancelled it, what the US Navy might now have to do next, at a time where the People's Liberation Army Navy is cranking out modern warships, while the US seemingly hasn't hit a surface combatant design home run since last century. Before we jump into it though, let me welcome back a sponsor. Unfortunately, it's just not possible for every major global event to get its own 1-hour PowerPoint. Sometimes news headlines might have to do, but different organisations might often choose to elevate different information or angles to the headline, meaning if you want to get a slightly fuller view, you're going to want to see more than one. For example, this headline reports an explosion in Russia's Black Sea port city of Novorossiysk. This one gives us a potential cause, a Ukrainian strike, and flags an impact on oil shipments, while this one introduces a potential so what factor, a jump in the oil price. The tool being used here to quickly flip between headlines is long-term channel sponsor Ground News, a combination website and app that doesn't just draw on thousands of news sources around the world, it also potentially provides context. I'm a big fan, for example, of often having ownership information right there. It also allows you to do things like hone your coverage in on particular topics that interest you, as well as potentially draw on tools like the blind spot feed. What that can potentially allow you to do is gain a bit of awareness of what's being reported by sources you might not ordinarily consume, which, whether they're good sources or not, might give you greater awareness of what others might be seeing and reading. For me at least, that's often a point of curiosity, and it's one of the reasons why I've been using Ground News for years at this point. So if you're interested, there will be a link in the description that'll give you access to a 40% discount on a Ground News Vantage plan, which is the one I use, and which gives you access to a full range of features. And so with my thanks to Ground News for being this channel's longest running sponsors, let's get back to it. Okay, so let's start with a key point around the why here. Why a Navy's different in a way that makes it really painful if you stuff up a modernisation effort or four. Because if this video was just about the US spending many years and billions of dollars to ultimately not build a new class of frigates, then that would be one thing. Not a great thing to be sure, especially from a US taxpayer perspective, but the Constellation wasn't just any design and procurement program, it was a warship design and procurement program. In previous videos, you would have heard me use the maxim that naval strategy is built strategy. That saying encapsulates a lot of things, that ships are expensive, that they take a long time to build, that the infrastructure to build them takes even longer, and so if you're a decision maker lacking in patience or with significant commitment issues, the Navy game might not be for you. It generally greatly rewards forward planning and persistence, and punishes procrastination. I've heard it said that the best way to get a house in 2025 is to have bought it for $2,000 and a slab of beers back in 1955. Navies are kind of the same. They reward legacy investors and they punish recent entrants. This differentiates them significantly from, for example, ground armies. Those can benefit from a lot of expensive, long lead time, capital-intensive equipment, but if you don't have all that stuff on hand and find yourself in a difficult situation, the ground combat domain has some opportunities to generate combat power quickly. The Ukrainians and Russians have arguably both demonstrated this really well. They've both taken some stockpiles or external supplies of more complex, advanced military equipment, but a lot of their combat power now is the result of industrial and military mobilisation. It may not be fantastic training, but we've seen both sides sometimes push new recruits through basic in a couple of weeks. A lot of the basic equipment required, like small arms, are widely available, and in many cases where a dedicated military system isn't available, you can kind of make do with stuff from the civilian market. Don't have dedicated military communication systems? We've seen them lash together stuff using Starlink and Discord. Lacking ISR assets and PGMs? Enter civilian drones or military drones produced using civilian components. And when it comes time to get infantry and supplies to the front line, there's always the assault ladder. And in many cases, even the dedicated military systems are going to be easier to produce and easier to ramp up production of. It's not an exaggeration to say that for some ground combat systems, it might be faster to build a new factory than it is to build a warship in an existing shipyard. Being caught unprepared for a protracted ground war then is clearly a big deal and a terrible idea, but if you can hold on long enough and industrially mobilise hard enough, you can potentially dig your way out. With navies, from an industrial perspective, the consequences of everything flow through much more slowly. If you take your foot off the production pedal, it might take years or decades before you start to really feel the impact and keep running the ships that you already have, but you better hope you put your foot down again before you have to start retiring those things because of just how long the gap is from investment to output. And that's where the context for today comes in. Not so much the struggles of a single program, but the slow-burning fuse on a bomb at the heart of US naval power. And to understand what I mean, I think we need to go back to, in a sense, the top. The point which explains both why the US had so much runway, so much time to try and get this right, and why it matters so much that they seem to be incapable of doing so. The recent peak of US warship numbers, the so-called 600-ship Navy of the late 1980s. US naval power waxed and waned several times over the Cold War. In the early days, things were relatively easy because the country had built approximately infinity warships during the Second World War and could just decide how many it put into or out of reserve to meet international crises. But over time, new waves of construction produced inconsistent force levels. When Reagan came into power, there was a lot of money available to get that line pushing up again. The rhetorical target was for a 600 battle force ship Navy. Despite the money on the table, according to the Navy's History and Heritage Command, the force never quite got there, but it did get close. The force peaked in 1989 at 4 battleships, 14 carriers, 40 cruisers, 68 destroyers, 100 frigates, 99 attack submarines, 36 ballistic missile submarines, and a grand total of 592 active battle force ships. But to get to that number, using the funds and more importantly, the time available, the Pentagon had to come at the problem from multiple angles. They had to try and dial up new ship production, sure, but a lot of the numbers had to be made up by reactivating old hulls, delaying retirements, and modernising existing vessels. Something that arguably came through very clearly if you look at the US Navy that went to war in 1991. This is a useful historical bookmark for us because the point at which those post-Cold War cuts hadn't really had time to slash down the force fully yet, and so the unceremonious curb stomp that followed is arguably the closest we ever came to seeing a late Cold War US military in conventional action. It also demonstrated pretty starkly the stunning contrast between the old and the new. The absolute grandpas of the late Cold War force, for example, were the Iowa-class battleships. These things had been reactivated partly in response to the Soviet Union showing off their new Kirov-class nuclear-powered battlecruisers, which had a completely different role to the Iowas, but they were big, intimidating, had lots of propaganda value, and so the Americans brought the Iowas back, stuck them with a bunch of modernizations, to the point where during the Gulf War we got to see a ship that had gone to war against Imperial Japan, not just dropping 16-inch shells, but firing off Tomahawk cruise missiles. The point is, the battleships were there as ancient hulls made relevant with recent upgrades, and there was no real way around the fact that the underlying hull had been designed for a very different war and belonged to a previous generation of surface combatant design. The US carrier fleet at the time was also chronologically diverse. And in this photo, taken in 1991, you can actually see 4 generations of US carrier design all operating in one place at the same time. On the bottom right, the relatively modern nuclear-powered supercarrier, USS Theodore Roosevelt, which is still in service today. And in the top left, a vessel that got to take on flagship duties during the Gulf War, CV-41 USS Midway. A ship designed for a time when the US Navy was worried about zeros and vowels, and which was commissioned in 1945. A lot of the cruisers the US Navy had available were also on the older side. A very interesting example was a one-off design, the USS Long Beach, which had the distinction of being the world's first ever nuclear-powered surface combatant. That's right, it was a nuclear-powered cruiser. These days, it's just Russia holding it in the nuclear-powered cruiser game, and even then, only just. But back in the later stage of the Cold War, the US had multiple classes of these things, including the original Long Beach and 4 and 2 ships respectively belonging to the Virginia and California classes. But the most numerous classes were things like the Belknap and Leahy class. In those cases, most of the hulls dated back to the 1960s, and while there were differences between them from a modernity standpoint, they had similar issues. Very large crews by modern ship standards, comparatively old-school sensors, arm-based missile launching systems, a bit more on that in a moment, and despite modernisation and refit, hulls that were getting close to the end of their intended service lives. You could also say a chunk of the US destroyer force was also in a similar boat. The first of the old Charles F. Adams-class destroyers had first been commissioned back in the 1960s. They displaced about 4,500 tonnes with an anemic missile armament, fairly basic sensors, and a lot of crew relative to the capability they brought. They existed, but unsurprisingly as it turned out, the last one would be retired by 1993. And then critically to our story today of the Constellation class, the late Cold War era US Navy also had a frigate. These were the Oliver Hazard Perry class, roughly 4,000 tonnes, first entering service in 1977, with more than 70 ships being built for multiple countries. The general idea of a small surface combatant like the Perry is that you could have a cheaper ship with a smaller complement, Perry came in at about 175 crew members, and use that to go out and do jobs that you didn't require a 15,000-tonne nuclear-powered cruiser for. There was, however, a bit of a problem with all of these ships, from the relatively new Perrys to the vessels that were built in the 1950s. As well as many of them being very old and due for a bit of a kip, they missed at least 2 modern technological innovations: the Aegis combat system and the cell-based vertical launch system. Aegis brought together multiple elements. We've talked about sensors and automation in the past, but some of the most important teeth of the system came in the form of the Mark 41 vertical launch system. VLS were a major advance over older ARM-based systems for at least a few reasons. One, they were super flexible. A Mark 41 cell could accommodate everything from a Tomahawk cruise missile for attacking land targets, through to eventually an SM-3 for shooting down ballistic missiles outside Earth's atmosphere, or a bunch of smaller anti-aircraft missiles all packed into the single cell. That meant a ship could be multi-purpose, that its armament could be reconfigured for various missions, and that an opponent would never be entirely sure what it was carrying. They also in many cases helped improve total missile carrying capacity, and most importantly, allowed ships to launch those missiles a lot faster. The 1 or 2 arm systems on a Perry or an older US cruiser could launch 1 or 2 missiles at a time, reload relatively quickly, and then fire 1 or 2 more. With VLS though, a ship could go full Macross missile massacre mode, pop the lids on all of them, and salvo basically the entire payload at once if necessary. Expensive? Sure. But for offensive and defensive purposes, really, really useful. There are plenty of ways to get a ship killed at sea, and a VLS basically helps make sure that it's not by a reload timer. In short, there's a reason that basically everyone uses these things now. But in 1991, only a small minority of the surface combatants in US inventory actually had them. The Spruance-class destroyers, which had first entered service in 1975 with the newest hull being manufactured in the early 1980s, were sort of a halfway house. They were larger than the older destroyers, and a number of them were refitted to accommodate a 61-cell vertical launch system. But they hadn't been intended for those launches from the start, and they didn't have Aegis. That led the US Navy to essentially take a Spruance-class hull and modify it significantly to incorporate the Aegis combat system, a shit-ton more missiles, and accommodation for flag officers. That effort produced these things: the first Ticonderoga-class cruisers that were now closer to 10,000 tonnes, but had a similar crew size to some of the older vessels, roughly 330, and which after the first couple of ships were given an almost genre-defining VLS armament. 122 Mark 41 VLS cells, plus 8 Harpoon anti-ship missiles in box launchers, and the phalanx system for close-in defence. Compared to a lot of that other stuff that was still in inventory, the Tyco was a massive step change. They were an absolute linchpin in the naval build-up plan, and a number of them are still serving today. But they did still suffer with a bit of a legacy challenge. Namely, they were based on that old Spruance hull. And so the US was also pushing towards a new clean sheet design, one with a more modern hull design, more upgrade potential, and which was built from the ground up with all of these new technological developments in mind. That process gave us what is arguably the apex of US Cold War era surface combatant design, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. They had nearly 100 VLS cells, top-tier sensors, incorporated the Aegis combat system, had significant upgrade potential, as well as incorporating some of the latest survivability features and being intended for helicopter carriage from the start. The class would ultimately never get to really face off against the Soviet Navy. The first ship would enter service in 1991, but it was clearly so much better, so much more recent than what came before it, that even with the oncoming peace dividend, the US was still looking to transition into more of these ships regardless. And that starts to touch on what I'm really trying to get across here about the place the US Navy found itself in 1991. Yes, it was absolutely enormous and now had suddenly lost its only peer competitor, but it was also almost across the board in the midst of a massive forced modernisation cycle. A lot of the ships in inventory were ancient and weren't going to be fit for purpose much longer. And now it seemed budgets were going to be cut, just as basically every element of the force was in the process of rolling modernisation. A lot of the attack submarines, the skipjacks, the permits, the sturgeons had been built in the 1950s through 1970s. Those realistically would need to be retired and replaced, with the transition over the newer Los Angeles class already in progress at the time. With the boomers, some of the old Benjamin Franklin class were still in service, and those would all need to go as well, to be replaced first with the new Ohios, and then presumably eventually something to replace them as well. So if you're senior US Navy leadership in 1991, you have some elements going in your favour, and also a couple of massive problems. On the bad side, you have a huge number of hulls that need to be retired and soon. To no small extent, your 600-ship Navy of the 1980s had been held up by the building efforts of the 40s, 50s and 60s. As the Russians have been showing us in Ukraine, that coasting on legacy model can work for a while, but not forever. Second bad element, thanks to the Soviet Union suffering critical resistance failure, you no longer have the money to replace all of those old hulls on anything like a one-for-one basis. However, you do have at least three things going for you. One, you do have a lot of ships left over and a well-developed shipbuilding sector. You also now no longer have a peer opponent, meaning you have the luxury of making your new budget level work by both cutting ships from the fleet and also taking advantage of time. At a basic level, you might have heard this kind of approach being described as divest to invest. You get rid of a bunch of your old assets, selling them off or scrapping them in order to bring down your costs, and then you invest part of those savings in getting all new equipment for the part of the force that remains. In most cases, first with a few more late Cold War era designs, and then with something new. The focus today is on the surface combatants, and we'll get to those in a moment, but it was far from limited to them. All the old carrier classes would essentially be consolidated down into two: the Nimitz from the late Cold War era, and then eventually the Gerald R. Ford class. Today, despite some budget blowouts and delays, that's basically where the US Navy is. All the conventionally powered carriers are gone, and the first Ford is in service. The attack submarine force was consolidated down to a handful of Seawolves, but mostly the Los Angeles and Virginia class. There, the problem isn't so much the lack of a good design. The Virginia is generally regarded as a pretty damn good one, but instead just the capacity of the US submarine industrial base to turn them out quickly enough. Meanwhile, all the pre-Ohio class boomers were retired, leaving just the Ohios for the moment, with the new Columbia class currently in construction and due to enter service in the early 2030s. An absolute money furnace of a program to be sure, but one that for the moment appears to be in progress, which leaves the surface combatants and their roles. This chart here very roughly captures the state of play as the Soviet Union falls. The US Navy has a huge array of ship types, but for the ones we care about, we can fit them into four broad surface combatant roles. You have your small surface combatants, the frigates, destroyer and cruiser type large surface combatants, and then you have a separate job, naval gunfire support. This is important because Congress says it's a job the Navy needs to be able to do. And in 1990, they have a very heavily armoured ship with some very long-range guns that's pretty well suited to the role, the Iowa-class battleship. Almost all of this stuff in the legacy column, though, is behind the technological times and due for retirement. So what you need is a plan to get from the left to the right. First, potentially to what you might call a modern system, which is any Cold War or immediate post-Cold War design that comes from the Aegis and VLS era. Then beyond that, using all that beautiful time you have available to you at this point, due to the absence of a threat, you spin up next-generation systems that are designed from the ground up for the new security environment you now find yourself in. Part of the middle column essentially writes itself. You already have an Aegis destroyer and an Aegis cruiser, the Ticonderoga and the Arleigh Burke. So the Navy decides to carry on building most of the originally planned Ticonderogas and then retire basically the rest of the cruiser force without replacement, essentially getting to an all-Aegis cruiser force by throwing out all the non-Aegis capable ships. As for the destroyers, construction standardises on the Burke, although some of the old Spruance-class ships are refitted with VLS cells. So far, so good, but if you go back to the chart, we now have a couple of gaps here. There's nothing that can realistically do the naval gunfire support role without being hideously vulnerable, and there's no successor small surface combatant to help make up the fleet numbers. And so out of those broad gaps in a variety of programs and studies, we see at least two major ship types evolve. The solution, quote-unquote, for naval gunfire support was going to be a very futuristic destroyer. This was known by many names, but eventually became the Zumwalt class, which was going to combine stealthy features to make it difficult to detect and engage, with two advanced gun systems with specialised ammunition capable of extreme range precision fire. Now, you might reasonably ask what is realistically the difference between a precision-guided, extreme-range, million-dollar artillery shell and a missile, and the answer is simple. The shell ticks off the naval gunfire support requirement. Given you're already designing this fancy new stealth hull form anyway, there was also considerable thought given to using it for a cruiser. In 2001, the US Navy announced CGX. This was going to be a missile-carrying cruiser with a requirement for 18, later 19 vessels. And in 2005, we were told by the then Chief of Naval Operations that while the gun-carrying destroyer and the missile-carrying cruiser would be two different ships, the idea was that the Zumwalt hull and propulsion plant would be spiralled into the CGX program with about an 80% design overlap. So the US Navy would end up with an entire generation of stealthy surface combatants with at least some maintenance commonality, available essentially in both gun and missile spam options. But that still left the US Navy with a massive prospective gap lower down the displacement range. Industrially and militarily, the Navy needed something smaller. Industrially, because you wanted to keep your shipyards alive, and not all of them out there specialise in destroyers, cruisers, or aircraft carriers. What you can see here is a rough layout from the GAO of the US military shipbuilding sector. When you think US destroyers, for example, you probably think Maine and Mississippi. But Wisconsin and Alabama, they really specialise in the smaller stuff. And for a lot of missions, smaller is good enough. There was a need for something that might be survivable closer to the shore, which could do mine countermeasure work, while preferably having much fewer crew and much less sticker shock than the full-size destroyers and cruisers. That, from 2001 onwards, gave us the Littoral Combat Ship. By 2003, this was being called by Admiral Clark the most transformational effort for the Navy and its #1 budget priority for 2003. The idea, with billions on the table, was for a small ship that could basically do it all. Because the LCS was meant to be all singing, all dancing, capable of a variety of different roles, not by fitting all the specialised equipment and crew on every ship all the time, but instead by having quick swappable mission modules. So you could bring your mine hunter into port, play a quick bit of ship Lego, and suddenly you have another fast-moving anti-submarine warfare ship ready to go. And I do mean really ready to get up and go, because the LCS were meant to be able to pull at least 40 knots. A decision that would impose more than a bit of a design tax on the ships that would ultimately result. With plenty of time left on the clock, if you looked at the Navy in the very early 2000s, this was it. The Burkes, Tychos and older auxiliary ships could hold the fleet over, until the LCS could take over most of the old frigate and a bunch of support roles, and a new generation of stealthy experimental destroyers and cruisers could take on that gunfire, cruiser and destroyer role. Note at this stage, two of the ships we want to talk about, the Constellation and the DDGX, aren't even on the plan, and they wouldn't need to be until the next phase played out, where one after another, these next-generation programs basically imploded in spectacular fashion. For the most part, the middle column of that plan basically went fine. The Burkes and the Tychos were good ships, so those made up more and more of the fleet. Basically, any effort to design and build anything beyond them, though, somehow ended up combining a Half-Life 3 delivery timeline with a Star Sector budget and a Bethesda level of technical performance. When it comes to Zumwalt and LCS, I have done an entire video on the developmental train wreck. I'll link that in the description for those of you who want more of a deep dive, but in the context of the Constellation program, here's the basic spark notes. Over time, concern grew over whether or not Zumwalt was actually the right ship for the modern combat environment. Many of the technologies involved were immature, and so ultimately the cost per ship went way up, while the number of ships built went way down. The US Navy didn't end up with 30-plus destroyers as originally planned, it got three ships, for more than $22 billion in 2016 terms. And after all that, remember how one of the primary purposes of these things was to provide naval gunfire support to forces ashore? Yeah, the 3 ships that are in service are having their gun systems ripped out to replace them with hypersonic missile launchers. Chopping the plan down to only 3 hideously expensive Zumwalts obviously left a massive gap in the US Navy shipbuilding plans, which they mostly responded to by just building more Arleigh Burkes. The Burke was smaller, significantly cheaper, and better suited to the task of air and missile defence. The Navy came forward, I believe, as early as 2008, asking to double down on the older ship, which ultimately happened. Meanwhile, the LCS was also suffering with a cavalcade of problems. For one, the Navy arguably just asked for the wrong ship. A lot of design effort and expense, for example, went into making the ships as fast as they were. But not only were the LCS more expensive than intended, harder to maintain than intended, a lot of analysts pretty quickly contended that while the ships had the speed necessary to get somewhere quickly, what they didn't have was the payload necessary to do much militarily useful when they got there, or to protect themselves in the process. The quick swap mission module concept, the very thing that was meant to make the LCS a multi-purpose warship, didn't really work at the point at which they started building them, and they struggled to get it working later. In the end, the anti-submarine warfare module was basically cancelled, and the remaining modules focused basically on two areas: mine countermeasures and a surface warfare package. Concern also grew that the LCS didn't really have the armament necessary to do much in offensive terms, nor did it have much to defend itself with, to the point where we saw what you could arguably describe as the LCS most natural environment: the conflict in the Red Sea against the Houthis. It wasn't the LCS we saw the US Navy send in, it was the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and the carriers. So the number of LCS to be built was significantly cut down, a number have already been retired early, and in the short term, the Navy went back to building even more Arleigh Burkes. It's generally recognised, however, that there's only so far slamming the Burke button every time something goes wrong somewhere else in the US Navy can ultimately go. At this point, the ship design is decades old, and the US is arguably getting to the limit of how much additional shit they can bolt to the platform. Future upgrades are going to be hindered by fundamental characteristics of the ship that are hard to modify your way around: electrical power, cooling, and most fundamentally, space and available displacement. There is a US Navy plan to potentially build a Burke and Ticonderoga class successor. And with the absolute benefit of hindsight, you could potentially argue this is the kind of ship they should have built instead of the Zumwalt. According to the CRS, the DDG-X program is meant to create a ship with a displacement approximately 50% greater than the existing Arleigh Burke, more electrical power, better survivability, more upgrade compatibility, more range, more endurance, and more suitability for potential future technologies, like more powerful sensors or directed energy weapons. The focus doesn't appear to be so much on just maxing out the missile armament. What it is expected to have is better everything else. Quote, DDG-51, so Arleigh Burke, is highly capable, but after over 40 years in production and 30 years of upgrades, the hull form does not provide sufficient space and centre of gravity margin to host future capabilities. End quote. Basically, this is yet another attempt at a new large surface combatant. This time not a stealthy gun-toting super destroyer, but instead basically a bigger Burke. From the US Navy's perspective though, that still left them with a major small surface combatant problem. After all, if the current problem is that a 9,000-tonne destroyer is overkill for a bunch of jobs that the Navy needs to do, a 15,000-tonner is hardly going to do better. And so from the Navy's perspective, they still needed a smaller surface combatant that could actually do combat. And from an industrial perspective, all those shipyards that now wouldn't be building and maintaining swarms of LCS-class ships also presumably needed something to do. The US suffers enough from the availability of military shipbuilding capacity as it is, and so ideally you needed something smaller and cheaper than a destroyer that you could build in the likes of Alabama or Wisconsin. In many other navies around the world, that would be a frigate. And so years after the US Navy retired the last of its Perrys, someone came up with a revolutionary idea. How about we build a frigate? And it's here we get to the Constellation class and what, on paper, it was meant to do. In terms of capability, the basic brief here was to build something between the LCS and a full-sized Arleigh Burke. Some requirements from the LCS program were cut, like the multi-mission modules or the need to make the thing go 40 knots, but a lot of the things the Navy liked about the Arleigh Burke made their way into the requirements list. This ship was actually going to be able to defend itself against a range of air and missile threats. It would need to have the Aegis combat system, Arleigh Burke-esque sensors, and a vertical launch system. It wouldn't need to carry as many missiles as the likes of a Burke or a Tycho, but it would need to carry enough to be able to operate independently in some areas or support fleet activities in higher risk ones. After the LCS experience though, there was also the determination that the how Constellation was produced needed to be different. Namely, it needed to be fast and it needed to not go wrong. As the GAO put it in 2024, the Navy required that these frigates be more lethal and survivable than their predecessor, the Littoral Combat Ship, which the Navy and Congress truncated acquisition of following years of performance shortfalls, deficiencies and cost growth. The poor acquisition outcomes of LCS, coupled with evolving threats and persistent fleet needs for small surface combatant warships, prompted the Navy to accelerate delivery of the frigates by minimising technology development and streamlining the frigate acquisition approach. End quote. And as for how decision makers, including decision makers in Congress, wanted to do that, was by starting not with a clean sheet of paper, but instead something that already worked. This was going to be what's sometimes called a parent design approach ship, where you take an existing proven frigate design from somewhere on the international market, adapt it a bit to specific US requirements, but you leverage everything about that ship that's already there, as well as your own systems that you've already developed, in order to reduce the technical risk. Then, after just a bit of tweaking, you crank the things out. Or at least that's the theory. A number of different companies came forward with candidates for what was at that point called the FFG 62 program. One particularly bold submission, for example, was essentially an upgunned version of the LCS. Another interesting entrant was the Spanish F-100 class. I say interesting because it was essentially already an Aegis-equipped frigate with a Mark 41 VLS. Navantia had produced them for the Spanish Navy, and it had served as the basis for ship designs built for both the Royal Norwegian and Australian navies. The winner, however, was a different European frigate, which didn't come ready equipped with Aegis or the Mark 41, but which did come with a significant user base and a track record of international success. Fincantieri put forward their Fragata Europea Multimissione, the famous FREM, which was basically the Italian version of the multinational FREM frigate program. Across the board, just about everything about the baseline FREM design was scaled down compared to the likes of an Arleigh Burke. The displacement and crew complement were both smaller, about 6,700 tonnes and 200 respectively. The armament in the Italian version included a small European VLS, anti-ship missiles in box launchers, and various gun systems. They came with aviation facilities, a variety of advanced features, and reportedly no fewer than 5 espresso machines. Of course, what Fincantieri put forward was actually a proposal to modify the baseline FREM design, and the ships wouldn't be built by the yards in Italy that had produced previous FREMs, but by Fincantieri Marinette Marine in Wisconsin. But hey, there was room for a lot of know-how to transfer from the European yards over to the States, and many of the important subsystems proposed for integration would be provided by the US Navy itself. So clearly the risks were manageable, and in April 2020 it was announced that a contract had been awarded on a fixed price incentive basis for up to 10 ships, a definite contract for 1, and options on up to 9 more. Critically, this was a design, develop and construct contract. It wasn't the case of the US Navy designing a ship start to finish in-house and then going out to a shipyard and saying, hey, how much to build this thing? The Navy was also outsourcing a bunch of the design responsibility, which might sound risky, but then again, when you're contracting a firm to build a ship that is already built in the past, you can see why that might have seemed like a perfectly reasonable idea. As mentioned, there wouldn't need to be much in terms of truly new systems development. The Navy mandated the Aegis system and picked the radar, the Mark 41 VLS, the electronic warfare system, and the anti-submarine warfare combat suite. That meant that, unlike, for example, Zumwalt and the advanced gun system, or the LCS and the mission modules, there wouldn't be that much of risk of the ship being designed with a particular piece of technology in mind, and then the whole concept falling apart because that piece of technology ultimately didn't end up working or couldn't be fixed in time. Instead, you get basically an Arleigh Burke radar and 32 VLS for about half the cost of an Arleigh Burke. And for at least some voices in the Navy, the impression they tried to convey in public was one of relatively conservative approaches. As one Rear Admiral put it during the rollout of the Navy's 2021 budget, quote, "We don't want to have a repeat of some of the lessons of the LCS where we got going too fast," end quote. So, proven base design, proven manufacturer, proven subsystems, and a statement suggesting the Navy didn't intend to rush the process of ordering too many vessels too quickly. On first hearing, that probably all sounds great. So, let's talk about how it went wrong. The first major issue from which so many other challenges would ultimately flow is that while the FREM was a proven, capable, affordable frigate design, it was a European frigate design. The US Navy has very particular requirements for its warships, from survivability to mechanical redundancy to the performance necessary to keep up with the carriers, which can really get up and go thanks to those reactors. From the US perspective then, FREM might have been cool for an Italian design, but to accommodate US systems, US requirements, and the US way of doing things, the hoped-for tweaks to the original design quickly became less scalpel and more sledgehammer. I'd argue in some ways it's fairly predictable that would have to happen. It's often the case with shipbuilding programs that nations do have their own specific requirements, and often they're going to want to see their own domestic subsystems used if those happen to be available. An example relevant to America's interaction with the FREM, for example, might be, the FREM. Because if you compare the French and Italian versions of that ship, you might be surprised with how little commonality you actually find. And so I'd argue that in some respects, the surprising element shouldn't be that the Americans ultimately had to adjust the FREM design in order to get what they wanted. It's just how extensive they were, how they were made, and why the expectation of such high commonality was there in the first place. Because pretty quickly, Constellation and Frem started to look like very, very different ships. The hull was lengthened nearly 24 feet to accommodate larger generators and future growth. The bow was redesigned to remove the old sonar dome, the generator rating increased, the propellers were changed, the displacement increased, and as you can see from the silhouette there, just about everything above the waterline, from the armament to the sensors to the shape of the bloody ship, were thoroughly redesigned. An oft-quoted statistic is that the original hope had been that the Frem and Constellation would have roughly 85% commonality. Eventually, though, that intended 85% commonality would instead become closer to, reportedly, 15%, which meant a lot of the economies and risk mitigation you got from working from an existing design were steadily whittled away. But that didn't stop the US Navy going about getting these things ordered. The Detailed Design and Construction Award was handed out in April 2020. An option for a second ship, FFG-63, was exercised in May 2021, a third ship in June 2022, and the option on a fourth ship, FFG-65, was exercised in May 2023. And by that point, construction on the first ship in the class, the Constellation itself, had already started. It was announced in August 2022 that the ship had passed a production readiness review in July, and that construction would kick off on the 31st of August. As the Rear Admiral running the Program Office for Unmanned and Small Surface Combatants reportedly put at the time, quote, "Our team has worked tirelessly with industry partners to develop an innovative acquisition approach to efficiently procure and produce a 21st century frigate. The start of Constellation's construction marks a key milestone on our path to build and deliver this new capability to the fleet," end quote. There was, however, at least one teensy tiny complication. Even though the US had started building the ship, they hadn't actually finished designing it. Now, full disclosure here, being the radical risk taker that I am, I understand that with some things, the best approach might be to just pull the components together, start hammering, and figure it out as you go along. Normally though, that's more the business of IKEA furniture, not billion-dollar warships. The chart you can see on screen there is taken from a Government Accountability Office report and sets out the various modules of the Constellation, showing the percentage of 3D modelling of those sections that was complete as of October 2023. Of the 11 modules under construction at that time, only 6 were more than 91% modelled. 2 were between 76 and 90% done, and 3 were somewhere between 56 and 75%. Again, when they're already under construction. Even more fundamentally, at the time that construction kicked off in August 2022, not only was the detailed design and 3D modelling not done, the functional design of the ship wasn't necessarily complete either. When you're talking functional design, you are capturing some of the very basics. At the time construction kicked off, per the GAO, the functional design was reportedly 88% complete. 6 months after construction, it was 90%, a year later, 92%, and 16 months after construction had begun, the functional design was reportedly under Navy evaluation, but design stability hadn't actually been achieved yet. People were continuing to tinker 16 months after the ship had started being built. Now, to be fair, there might be a bit of controversy here about what exactly best practice is when it comes to kicking off construction before you have a completely finalised design. The Navy frigate was hardly the first program to do it, and there is some logic to suggesting that even if you're going to figure out the detailed internals later, you may sometimes be able to save some time by getting a head start on some of the more basic structural elements. The problems with that specifically here, though, were multifaceted. One, the program clearly didn't save that much time. Construction started in 2022, and in early 2025, an official from Fincantieri is reported to have said that the ship was 10% complete, and the company was quote-unquote converging the functional design with the Navy. What that suggests to me is that a lot of risk was introduced by starting construction early, without much in the way of payoff when it comes to construction speed. The second element is just how done, or rather not done, the design was at the point they pressed go. And as the GAO noted in its report, those functional design percentages might not necessarily mean what you think they mean. Quote, "The program's measure of functional design did not include 3D modelling. Leading ship design practices include 3D modelling of functional design to demonstrate design stability before the beginning of construction," end quote. And how that percentage was calculated, leaving aside 3D modelling, was also interesting. Quote, "The Frigate Program Office measures functional design progress based largely on the quantity of submitted contract deliverables," end quote. What on earth does that mean? As the report put it, quote, "The Navy implemented its unique specifications in 511 functional design documents, referred to as Contract Data Requirements List Items, CDRLs," end quote. And what reportedly was happening here is the Navy was counting percentages based on how many of those documents it had received and how many were complete. As of 2024, they had received and closed, so finally approved 168 CDRL items, while another 343 remained open. Now obviously, some of these might have been more important than others. This arguably shouldn't be a Gimli situation where everything counts as one. And the GAO suggested there may also have been a bit of a partial credit problem. Quote, "The Navy computes and tracks functional design stability based predominantly on the quantity of CDRL items the shipbuilder has submitted to the Navy to review, rather than on the quality of those items. For example, the program's calculated functional design stability at construction start was based on a metric that scores designed CDRL items as 50 to 75% complete merely because the shipbuilder had submitted them to the Navy, but did not consider the quality of the CDRL item." End quote. AKA, this is kind of like a university marking system where you get between 50 and 75% just for handing something in before they even consider what you've actually written on the paper. As you can imagine, that might have created some interesting incentives. Quote, "Navy engineering officials noted instances where the Navy received items largely incomplete and in some cases without any design content from the frigate shipbuilder, an occurrence the Navy officials attributed to the contractor's desire to meet a contract deadline for submitting a given CDRL item. In such instances, the Navy has credited those largely incomplete items as 50% complete. These practices and metrics caused the frigate's functional design to appear more complete than what had been achieved." End quote. Now, hypothetically, if someone did actually use a system that awarded 50% completion score, as long as something was submitted almost regardless of the content, I'm happy to volunteer my services to design the US Navy's next warship. I'll bid $200 million for the design work, submit as many blank sheets of paper as you like, maybe even draw a little stick figure destroyer if I want to add some value, and then having clearly done 50% of the functional design work, I'll happily settle for, say, 30% of the agreed fee. You know, mates rates and all that. Whatever the charts and reports said, at the time they started being built, the Constellation design was still very much in flux. And as time went on, an all too familiar pattern started to play out. The intended delivery timeline for the first ship began to slip in a serious way, from an originally intended 2026 to at least 2029. The costs of the ships were still projected to be significantly less than an Arleigh Burke, but not that cheap, and certainly more expensive than many European frigates. And the design, even as of 2025, was still potentially a bit of a work in progress. Not least of which because during all that tinkering, the Constellation had kind of let itself go a bit, with reports suggesting the ship had stacked on more than 700 metric tonnes more than intended, a roughly 13% displacement increase over earlier estimates. As you can imagine, for something that's meant to float and have upgrade potential to add more systems in the future, weight matters. With all that in play, the axe would finally fall last month. The Secretary of the Navy came out and said the following, quote, "We're reshaping how the Navy builds its fleet. Today I can announce the first public action is a strategic shift away from the Constellation-class frigate program. The Navy and our industry partners have reached a comprehensive framework that terminates, for the Navy's convenience, the last 4 ships in the class which have not begun construction. A key factor in the decision is the need to grow the fleet faster to meet tomorrow's threats. This framework seeks to put the Navy on a path to more rapidly construct new classes of ships and deliver the capabilities our warfighters need in greater numbers and faster." End quote. Basically, what appears to have been decided is the 2 hulls that are currently under construction will eventually be completed and presumably fielded by the Navy, but the 4 additional ships that had been ordered, or the 50 plus that might have been imagined by some versions of the US Navy's future fleet plans, were gone. Ultimately implying that between Zumwalt, the LCS, and Constellation, the US is ultimately going to have spent billions of dollars to acquire a gunfire support vessel that doesn't carry guns, a coastal combatant that can't survive near the coast, and a cheap, mostly off-the-shelf and widely available frigate, which is expensive, bespoke, and has a grand total of 2 vessels built. There's also an element of what those statements imply that I think cast a particularly dark shadow over the program as a whole. What the Secretary appears to be suggesting is that from the US Navy's perspective, speed of construction and fielding is the important element here. If that's the case, assuming the Navy hasn't given up on the idea of a small surface combatant entirely, it would seem strange to cancel a program that appeared to be almost through development hell and preparing for full-rate production on the justification that you want to be able to build more ships quickly, which suggests either immense confidence in the ability of the Navy to do something else, or an even more pessimistic outlook on the ability to get the Constellations fielded by that target entry date of 2029. If you worked on that program, that's probably a bit of a gut punch. A lot of brain calories, sweat and dollars were expended on that program, and to see it all ultimately come to almost nothing after steel had already been cut can hardly be a pleasant experience for any of those involved, including the US taxpayer. For the ships and the shipyard, the cancellation is potentially a major problem. The shipyards just lost a bunch of future work, and while they have these 2 hulls plus some export vessels for the Saudis, the future of their build queue is now a bit of an open question. Fincantieri seems to be expecting that new orders for different ship types will make up the difference, so to speak, and keep the shipyards busy, but time will tell. The US Navy is also presumably going to end up with a unique class of 2 vessels that need their own supply chain, their own sustainment system, and if you split all of the R&D costs over just 2 hulls, there's a chance that on paper, they experience a bit of B2 Spirit syndrome, looking far more expensive per example than was originally intended, to the point where, realistically, you might just have been better off building more Berks. In terms of what, from a defence economics perspective, we might learn from this entire process and what might need to change in US shipbuilding in the future, that's probably a future episode all of its own. The bumpy story of US military shipbuilding isn't the kind of thing you want to cram into a couple of minutes, but for the moment, I think it suffices to say at least 2 things. Firstly, from the point of view of many commentators and organisations like the GAO, things need to change. It's not that the US Navy's approach to designing and building brand new surface combatants delivers inconsistent results, it's that it delivers consistently bad results, or at least results well short of what the Navy says it needs. And so from how ships are designed and iterated, when they're placed into construction, how they're constructed, how they're maintained and iterated once they enter the fleet, there are recommendations US decision makers are going to have to work through in order to figure out what might have to change. More fundamentally, and this might be a dash of professional bias coming through, I think there's an argument to be made that what Zumwalt, CGX, LCS, the Constellation frigate all demonstrate is the importance, right at the start of the process, of making sure you're asking for the right thing, getting the requirement right. With Zumwalt and LCS, yes, there were a range of technical issues, risks and things that didn't pan out as intended, but at a basic level, you could also argue the Navy just asked for the wrong ship. By the time the Zumwalt was coming online, the Navy didn't need a shore bombardment destroyer. It needed more air and missile defence, including ballistic missile defence capabilities for the fleet. It needed to be able to handle the missile arsenals of countries like Iran or forces like the Houthis. It needed to plan with potential competitors like China in mind. And both Zumwalt and LCS might have made more sense in the world of 1995, but perhaps less suitable for the realities of 2025. With Constellation, the US arguably got closer to picking what it actually wanted, but still missed. What the Navy and Congress fundamentally wanted were 2 similar but distinct things. A US specification frigate that was basically an Arleigh Burke, and also a low-risk, off-the-shelf, rapidly available design. They tried to make something that was both, and it just didn't work. It would have been one thing to accept a change in the requirements, a lower survivability and performance spec, and use a mostly off-the-shelf design. It would have been another to start with a clean sheet of paper and design a truly US frigate from scratch, potentially taking inspiration from something like the Burke. But trying to apply the parent design approach to something you were going to change that dramatically ultimately may have caused more problems than it solved. Per a CRS report on the program, quote, a Navy official commenting on the FFG 62 program in February 2025 reportedly stated that, quote, it turns out that modifying someone else's design is a lot harder than it seems, and that sometimes you're just better off designing a new ship, end quote. Another Navy official reportedly said that, quote, I'll be brutally honest, I don't think people truly understood what it meant to adapt a parent design to Navy requirements, end quote. And while that might be true, a massive question here might be, why? History is replete with examples, even recent examples, of countries taking mature, proven designs of just about anything, from a combat vehicle to a warship, trying to change just about everything about it to make exactly what they want, and ending up with something that doesn't have any of the original reliability magic. The Ascod II armoured fighting vehicle that the British Ajax is based on is a functional, proven, reliable design. Ajax isn't. FREM is a proven, reliable, affordable frigate design. But in its quest to improve on that parent design in 100 different ways, Constellation isn't either. And so my personal hope for military procurement functions worldwide is that countries think a bit more about how they use parent design processes, and that in particular, you're honest about what you want to try and achieve when you're picking the method up front. If you have the discipline to avoid tinkering too much and are willing to take what is mostly on the market, by all means, go with a parent design. Change the labels over to your language, maybe bring in your own battle management system, etc. But realistically, if you're not going to budge on a bunch of divergent requirements, if you are going to tinker, then in some cases there might be value to being honest about the process and starting essentially with a list of the systems and weapons that you want integrated, and otherwise a clean sheet of paper. Regardless, where does that put the US Navy going forward? Now the budgetary guillotine has come for the frigate as it did for the LCS and the Zumwalt before. One thing's clear, the US Navy has a very big problem. Again, Actually, it's arguably kind of the same problem we described existing since the end of the Cold War. You have a fleet full of warships that are essentially aging out of service. Some of the remaining Tycho hulls, for example, probably aren't that far removed from browsing retirement home packages in their spare time. But, unlike back in 1991, the problem is even more acute now for a couple of reasons. One, according to its plan, the US Navy can no longer strategically afford to just retire a bunch of surface combatants without replacements. In the 1990s, the US didn't have to have a modern replacement ship ready for every old vessel that it retired. The fleet was already massive. Now, though, the fleet is already smaller than many in Congress and the Navy High Command would like. And unlike back in 1991, when the previous peer competitor was rusting out in its shipyards, now from the US perspective there's a new pacing threat on the block that actually knows how to design and build ships. In terms of battle force hull count, if not displacement, the People's Liberation Army Navy is already larger than the US one. One US estimate is that the PLAN will grow to 435 battle force ships by 2030. The US Navy's 2025 budget submission suggested that by 2030, the US would have 294. Basically, in the past, the US had the luxury of plenty of time. Now, a lot of that time has been used up on failed design and modernisation programs. And so if you're looking at the challenges Washington now faces in strategic terms at a high level, there's a number of them, and they all have to be solved relatively quickly. 1. The US Navy simply needs more ships. 2. There are a number of shipyards out there that need something to do, and they can't build full-size destroyers. 3. The fleet clearly needs more magazine depth, just more VLS cells out there to help protect the carriers and carry out other critical missions. And ideally, the US might want to find a way to do all that using the intended budget and on a short time frame. Under ordinary circumstances, the US might want to turn to its allies to try and make up the slack on any particular deployment or operation. In very broad strokes, the US Navy does have a lot of the higher-end, more expensive capabilities, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and attack submarines, for example, while a lot of its allies and partners are short on those assets, but long on surface combatants of all kinds. The Japanese, for example, have more than 40 active destroyers and frigates of various kinds. Only 8 of those, from memory, are the larger Aegis-style ships, but a lot would be capable of doing most of what something like Constellation was meant to do. That said, especially in the current climate, US planning is likely to continue to call for the Navy itself to put a focus on its own organic capabilities. So without necessarily trying to predict what the US Navy will do, good luck with that, let's go over a couple of things they could do. Response 1 to scaling back or cancelling a fleet of new surface combatants would be the same response we saw the last time the US Navy cancelled or scaled back a new family of large surface combatants. You build more Burks. And while it might be oversized and overly capable for some of the jobs Constellation was meant to do, it can do them. So in the interim, while you figure out what you're going to do next, you pump these out as fast as you can and also look at some of the older ships. Some of the older Burks, potentially the Ticonderoga-class cruisers, and ask where you might be able to do life extension or upgrades in order to keep those hulls in service just that bit longer. The challenge of getting enough destroyers in the water, though, even if the funding becomes available, is going to be shipyard capacity. And so once again, I imagine at least some commentators are going to suggest the absolute heresy from the American perspective of ordering ships from allies. The United States is allied with at least 2 major shipbuilding powers, the Republic of Korea and Japan. And the Koreans have actively come forward in the past with a proposal to build warships for the US Navy in the Republic of Korea. Now, there would be some complications, which I think are sometimes left out of news coverage on this stuff, like the fact that a lot of the advanced subsystems, especially the stuff necessary for a full Aegis suite, is often going to come from the United States, not the shipbuilding nation itself. And so you might still have supply constraints even if the foreign shipyards are up to the task of building the hulls at a certain pace. There's no reason to doubt the ability of some of the US allies out there to build a basically US-style warship. The ROK has already designed and built destroyers that accommodate Aegis and a significant missile armament. So I think there's fair reason to believe that as long as the US Navy is willing to be a little bit flexible with its requirements, foreign building at least a number of ships might be a way to bulk out the force. Of course, traditionally there have been a couple of objections to that kind of approach, and I want to cover at least 2. 1, it's often been argued that from an industrial strategy perspective, it's better to spend US tax dollars building ships in the United States and supporting the US military shipbuilding sector, even if that's more expensive than building them overseas. To which my response in this scenario might be, that's great. The US is almost certainly still going to do that, but if you need more ships in the short to medium term than the US can realistically produce, then it might be worth ordering some of these hopefully more affordable ships now until eventually US shipbuilding capacity catches up. Another potential activity which might not be optional if that foreign build concept is explored more seriously is the US Navy doing a little bit of introspection about how it defines its requirements and where it might be worth providing a little more design flexibility in exchange for affordability and accessibility. It's arguably mostly the case that US requirements on everything, from survivability to mechanical redundancy, exist for a reason. But I think there's a risk in any kind of military development program that something that should be in the wants column finds its way into the needs. It's a bit of a stretch, for example, to say that South Korean or European warships are death traps. They do incorporate survivability features, just not the same ones and to the same extent that the US Navy requires. And in a fleet building game like this one, there might be a trade-off for making those asks. Sure, it's possible that some of the modifications the US Navy might request to a foreign design might in some scenarios end up saving lives. But it's also possible that lives are lost or battlefield dynamics shift in a very negative way simply because you didn't have enough ships available, because you didn't have the sensors and cells where they needed to be to intercept those incoming missiles or hunt that enemy submarine, or maybe even not being able to respond to a military contingency at all because the ships are not available. In the Navy game, quantity and quality can both matter. And so I think there might be a case to be made for all navies in future development programs to have a very close look at what they're saying they absolutely need and why they're saying that. Of course, whether or not foreign shipbuilders are engaged in some way to support US shipbuilding, the US is still going to want to be building its own ships. And that being the case with the Constellation Axt, that probably puts the spotlight squarely on basically the last man standing when it comes to US surface combatant development, DDGX. Industrially, militarily, heck, psychologically, US surface combatant design and shipbuilding arguably needs a win. DDGX is meant to be that next generation ship, something that can finally come after the Burkes and the Tychos. And while I've seen some commentary suggesting that you might not actually need this ship as the United States, you could instead continue upgrading and building the Burkes presumably until the heat death of the universe, I'd argue that unlike in the 1990s or the early 2000s, the US Navy is no longer in a world where it can basically afford to pick its own pace when it comes to warship development. Others are pushing the envelope too. The People's Liberation Army Navy, for example, already has its Type 55s. These things have more VLS cells than a Burke, and at about 11,000 tonnes reported standard displacement, they're bigger than either the Burke or the Tycho. The ships and the design are also much newer, with the first one entering service in 2020. Now, to be fair, there's a lot we don't know about the Type 55 or other PRC surface combatants, but the point is more, if the US Navy's plan is to maintain some sort of qualitative edge, realistically, you can't coast on the Burke forever. And given the timelines and pressures involved, DDGX might just be the path of least resistance, past that critical development checkpoint. Then there's still the question of what to do with America's smaller military shipbuilding yards, and whether the Navy still wants a combat ship somewhere between a destroyer and the LCS. If the stated priority, as we heard from the Secretary of the Navy, is to try and field more ships quickly, you're logically going to want to use all the yards you have available. So it's going to be interesting to see what the US ultimately decides to build in them. After all that, for example, do you still want an Aegis-equipped frigate? If so, what kind? Are you willing to relax the requirements a bunch and basically just take a foreign design as close to as is as possible without redesigning it from the ground up to fit USN requirements? Or do you want to go out and generate a clean sheet USN frigate design? And if you do, why are you going to make that the starting point? And how will you get that to the point of construction quicker than just going with the Constellation such as it is? If you do go with a new design, what do you choose to emphasise? Is the goal to get cheaper costs or a smaller crew complement than the Constellation? And if so, what capability are you willing to sacrifice to get there? Another option to utilise some of these yards, which might not be mutually exclusive with building things like frigates, would be to leverage more unmanned or optionally manned systems. The US Navy's long-term planning has always assumed that manned warships would be augmented by unmanned ones. And so if you're looking for cheaper, smaller designs that might be able to rapidly add additional VLS cells, for example, to the fleet in the short run, maybe that's an option for some of these smaller yards. The German Navy, for example, is reportedly looking to procure what have been described as large remote missile vessels. Basically, the concept here seems to be that one way you can offset the fact the Germans didn't originally put a huge number of VLS cells on their frigates would be by getting basically an unmanned arsenal ship with a bunch of missiles on it to follow the frigates around and serve as that vessel's magazine extender, if you like. As an unmanned vessel, you'd probably expect it to be smaller, cheaper, and not need the same survivability features as one with hundreds of actual humans aboard. And a lot of these concepts don't tend to include all of the expensive sensors going onto the unmanned vessel, instead requiring it to network with a manned one that has all of the expensive radar. Not to mention the human officers that make the decision on when or if those missiles should be used. There are obviously plenty of jobs this kind of vessel wouldn't be capable of doing, namely anything involving independent operation, but if the goal is just to find a way to add a lot more missiles to a multi-ship force as cheaply as possible, this might be worth looking at. The point is that at this stage, it might pay to combine both more and less creative solutions. You probably need to go ahead with the stuff that you know is going to work, like pumping out existing designs, while also pushing ahead with the more innovative and future-focused stuff. And above all, after the way some of these programs have played out over the last several decades, I suspect there's probably going to be some deep thinking about at least two things: what the US Navy actually wants to design and build next, and how it designs and builds things. When it comes to military shipbuilding design and construction, there is always a lot that can go wrong. There are plenty of other examples around the world of nations that have bet big on a major ship modernisation program or a new design, only to not have it pan out. US naval power and US strategy have long been incredibly tightly linked. But naval strategy is built strategy, and the US Navy is now facing the natural consequences of multiple failed or dialed-back development programs. Constellation, FFG 62, was meant to reverse that trend. Instead, it now seems likely to take its place among the others as yet another false start. As for what the US Navy will do now, to try and get more warships in the water, support the shipbuilding sector and shape the naval balance via peer competitors, only time will ultimately tell. But after multiple programs ending up the way they have, from a US strategic perspective, one thing is, I'd argue, abundantly clear. Whatever they try next, it better work. And okay, brief channel update to close out. Firstly, thank you to everyone who requested this topic. I don't think I've ever received more emails or requests over on Patreon for any particular topic ever than I did after the news of Constellation's cancellation came through. I still do want to do a detailed study on the US military shipbuilding sector at some point, but given the amount of research I'd like to see go into that, I'd suspect some point in mid-late 2026. In the meantime, Constellation is, I think, a valuable story all of its own. And while yes, as the world's preeminent naval power, we are picking on the United States today, as I flagged at the start, there's plenty to suggest that the risks and lessons here have been and can be deeply relevant for other countries as well. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it interesting, and with any luck, I hope to see you all again next week.